Hi, this is Emily Thorpe, and today I'll be talking about the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and his New Deal. The good times of the 1920s had come to an end, beginning with the stock market crash of October 1929. Instead of the laid-back and fun times of the 1920s, many Americans found themselves struggling to stay on their feet financially. Many were seeing their families going hungry, their homes foreclosed, and themselves losing their jobs. In the late 1920s, the stock market seemed to be the ideal place to earn money quickly. However, when October 24th, 1929, otherwise known as Black Thursday, came along, few buyers were present on Wall Street due to fluctuating stock prices that had been occurring since September. The stock market collapsed 5 days later due to a resumption of selling at an intense rate. The crash ultimately brought the country's economic flaws to the surface. Although stock market crash in 1929 was a major event in the beginning days of the Depression, it was not the primary cause. Other elements that led to the Great Depression included industrial and agricultural overproduction, an unequal distribution of wealth in America, an overextension of credit, a weak bank system, and a struggling international economy due to World War I. In addition to these factors, the government lacked the programs to lessen the blow of an economic depression were to occur. Herbert Hoover, as president at that time, decided the best decision was to try and maintain public confidence in the economy. Hoover was a strong believer in limited government intervention and self-regulating business. These beliefs initially prevented him from taking action against the circumstances of this economic depression. Due to the worsening state of the economy, Hoover did eventually help establish two privately funded organizations, still staying true to his fundamental beliefs. One of these organizations was the National Credit Association. The essential purpose of this organization was to provide emergency loans to businesses. The second organization was the Organization for Unemployment Relief, which was a place in which relief agencies could be evaluated. No one actually benefited from these because state and local governments were too far in debt. All this was too little, too late. Because of his poor efforts to help the country during this time of distress, Hoover became known as the Do-Nothing President. The 1932 presidential campaign was the country's chance to turn things around. The two main candidates were Herbert Hoover, the Republican nominee, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, the Democrat nominee. Roosevelt promised the voters for more government action if he were elected president, and his campaign gave the country a renewed sense of hope. If you were paying attention, you will be able to tell me based on the Electoral College vote map who won the 1932 election. If you said FDR, you're correct. On the slide I have an audio clip of FDR's first inaugural speech. I won't play it for you right now, but instead tell you its significance. This is one of the biggest gestures made that provided the United States with a great sense of hope that the economy would somehow regain its strength again. One of FDR's most famous quotes came from this first inaugural speech. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Between 1930 and 1932, there was a widespread bank failure in the United States. During this period, over 5,000 banks failed. Because of this, the population would withdraw their money from banks. To avoid total failure, banks would have to take bank holidays to prevent total collapse. A bank holiday is basically a day in which a bank would close so no one could make any withdrawals. To try and find a solution to this growing problem, FDR called Congress back into session on March 6, 1933, and proclaimed a national bank holiday. He enacted an emergency bank proposal that provided the federal inspection of all banks. Those that were deemed stable would be allowed to reopen. If they were not found to be in stable condition, they would either be closed for good or the government would aid them in revival. The night this proposal was passed in Congress, Roosevelt had a fireside chat, which our radio shows he did to talk to the American public to discuss it. The next day, the population began putting their trust back in the bank system, and by the end of March 1933, the problem was finished. The purposes of the New Deal can be summarized by 3 R's: relief, reform, and recovery. Relief involves providing money to organizations that can aid citizens, creating jobs for the unemployed, and protecting farmers and other citizens from foreclosure. Reform focuses on government regulation of banks, abolishing child labor, conserving farmlands, and preventing unfair labor practices. Finally, recovery works to provide the economy and citizens with the correct tools to be successful once again. These 3 R's all work towards the goal of saving and preserving capitalism. The reforms made for banking that I discussed earlier were the beginning of a special session of Congress known as the first 100 days. The session lasted from March 9th to June 16, 1933, which in that time allowed Franklin D. Roosevelt to push through multiple pieces of legislation. These pieces of legislation were created to help solve the problems of failing big business, agriculture, as well as high unemployment rates. This bundle of laws is known as alphabet soup for the anagrams they were known by. The ones I will discuss include the CCC, CWA, FDIC, SEC, TVA, AAA, and IRA, and the WPA. The Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC, took city boys and gave them jobs in the country. These boys were paid $30 a month to perform jobs such as cleaning beaches, building wildlife shelters, and fighting forest fires. This organization was so successful because all these jobs were set in an area where the boys couldn't spend their money on anything, and instead the money was sent to their families back home to feed mouths and prevent home foreclosure. This was one of the most successful pieces of the New Deal. The Civil Works Administration was another way in which the government provided jobs to citizens. The people hired would work on projects such as paving roads, building airports, and running nursery schools. The CWA was developed from the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was not successful because all it did was provide a budget to aid states in helping the unemployed. It did not provide the same moral to someone as actually having a job. Two groups that provided reforms for financial issues at hand were the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The Securities and Exchange Commission oversaw stock and bond markets, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured deposits that reached up to $5,000. One of Roosevelt's strongest beliefs is that poverty could be eradicated through careful development of natural resources. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created on this founding principle. This organization aided the Tennessee Valley area, which at this time was one of the poorest regions of the country. It provided jobs to the unemployed of this area, in which they could develop the area by building dams and hydroelectric plants. These resources provided cheap electricity to the community and factory jobs to the locals. The Agricultural Adjustment Act confronted the issue of overproduction in America's farmlands. They did this by compensating farmers to produce less crops and use less land. Because of this, farm income increased. This also created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to oversee this process. The National Industry Recovery Act created the Public Works Administration and the National Recovery Administration. However, the NRA was more successful. The National Recovery Administration created a partnership between business, labor, and the government. Although the first New Deal was overall successful, many were still dealing with unemployment rates across the country. Because of this, FDR presented a list of reforms to Congress in the spring of 1935. This list included a request for $4.8 billion in relief to be distributed among the present organizations and to create the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration was very successful, being able to employ 25% of the country's workforce. The only negative aspect was that several of these jobs were low-paying and temporary to avoid competition with private enterprises. Types of jobs those employed would perform included repairing the country's infrastructure, such as roads, and bridges, and building schools. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a national pension fund, unemployment insurance program, and public assistance programs for dependent mothers and children, the physically disabled, and those in chronic need. This was funded by a payroll tax that started in 1937. Although a law of this type was greatly needed, there were many flaws to the plan. These include the exclusion of wage earners such as domestics, farm workers, and self-employed. Also, it taxed everyone at a fixed rate, which became a burden to all those that had smaller wages. The Wagner Act of 1935 stated that no unfair labor practice would be used, such as spying on employees to see if they were part of a union. This also created the National Labor Relations Board. FDR's second term in office saw a loss of momentum in the New Deal policies because the people were once again becoming confident in the economy. However, there was one key piece of legislation passed during this time called the Fair Labor Standards Act. This law made a monumental difference in labor rights. It abolished child labor, gave minimum hourly wage of 40 cents, and a maximum work week of 40 hours. Also during his second term, Roosevelt took part in a famous court packing. Under this plan, he stated that he would add one judge for each sitting justice over the age of 70 who refused to retire. This plan created 6 new positions in the Supreme Court. His goal was to pack the court with people who would support his New Deal. However, this plan failed. Another significant part of his second term was dealing with the rise of Nazi power in Europe. At first, he would decide to remain neutral in the war, but once Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese, FDR called for Congress to enter it. FDR's New Deal provided fiscal rehabilitation to the nation by creating hydroelectric plants and reforming infrastructure. It also provided the help needed to suffering citizens to get jobs as well as prevent foreclosure and starvation. It revitalized politics and gave an extension to the definition of democracy. It also strengthened the executive branch's power by Congress relying on him to provide guidance during this stressful time in American history. However, this did not end the Great Depression. It only provided the tools necessary to dig the country out of this ditch.